Happy New Year! Unfortunately, it seems I was on the naughty list this year because Santa Claus left me a big lump of coal in my stocking in the form of Neopets meta showing signs of life on Twitter. I do, however, want to move on to talking about better and brighter things, but I feel I can't talk about the wonderful world of Neopia while completely ignoring the fact that it's been mismanaged and neglected for years by NetDragon and Jumpstart, only to now be carelessly forked into a sketchy play-to-earn blockchain game with only the vaguest understanding of what Neopets is and no regard for the current passionate user base or the world that's been lovingly cultivated with over 2 decades of immersive lore and history. Since I began writing the script, they have come out with a new statement and roadmap addressing some of those concerns, but I'll come back to that towards the end. For now and for the majority of the video, I really just want to focus on what actually makes Neopia so special and interesting. If you don't already know, there are essentially different versions of the Neopets canon that pertain to the different aspects of the site. Both the surface level site, where you care for your pets and interact with other users, and the high fantasy world of Neopia, where humans don't exist at all. The Neopets team has different language rules to follow for each of these iterations of reality, as seen in the canon Bibles, but you get the point. This has been a very rudimentary explanation, and all you really need to know is that in this video I will be specifically referring to the world of Neopia itself, and the lore and the characters therein. Out of all the aspects of the site, that is what truly ignites my soul. Though because I'm so passionate about it, it really stands out to me when there are pieces that don't necessarily fit perfectly with the others. And I don't think that's a bad thing. Neopia is a land rich with imagination. Part of what makes it so beautiful is the fact that so many people have touched it with their own creative magic and sparked life into it over the years. I just thought it would be fun to go over some of the questions that keep me up at night and how I personally imagine their potential answers. Of course, if you want to share your own headcanons in the comments or impart some wisdom or knowledge I may have overlooked or forgotten, that would make me very happy. Now, without further ado, let's finally get into the wild and wonderful world of Neopia. Let us begin with an iconic staple of Neopian culture. I think most people with even the vaguest knowledge of Neopets will recognize the significance of paintbrushes on the website, but how do they actually factor into the lore? We can ascertain that they do indeed exist, as evidenced by the fact that in Chapter 7, page 5 of the Fairies Rune, Hanso says that everything looks as though it's been painted with a great paintbrush. Paintbrushes in the context of the game make a lot of sense as a means of customization, but it does seem a bit odder to consider them in-universe. I sort of imagine it being somewhere between dyeing your hair and full-body reconstructive surgery, but of course magical. A lot of the solid colors are fairly straightforward, but sometimes things do get pretty wacky, which leads me to wonder what type of person would buy and or sell them, and if it would even be ethical to do so. I personally imagine that there are certain quote-unquote natural pet colors that can be inherited. And just as a side note, I was going to go into a whole section on genetics, but ultimately decided it didn't warrant its own tangent. Snarky said in a response to a question on her blog that essentially if you're wondering how a Skeeth and Zafara can have Ixie, Loop, and Gellert children, it's just because they can. But I digress. In contrast to the colors pets are born with, perhaps there are also colors that can only be achieved through painting, some other form of magical anomaly, or just getting straight up murdered. As we don't often see these colors on canon characters, I imagine painting and other transformations being relatively rare in universe. Some more fantastical colors, like Wraith, do have canon explanations, but others are just downright unfathomable. You're gonna tell me that jelly pets exist? Come on, let's be reasonable. What a joke. I did ask about this in an editorial and was extremely surprised to actually get an answer. I said, "Hi, I'm aware that there are different versions of the Neopets canon pertaining to the site itself and the actual high fantasy world of Neopia, and I'm wondering if there are certain pet colors that only exist on the site and not in the actual lore. It's difficult to imagine how colors like dimensional, toy, transparent, chocolate, origami, 8-bit, etc. would work on an actual plot character, unless perhaps they had a very specific backstory where they were exposed to some sort of magic or science experiment." And Gutterfoot responded, "I love this question and definitely agree that an 8-bit loop would be out of place in the lore. I like to imagine alternate Neopian universes, the ANU if you will, where there's a chocolate Neopia with a variant of Geordie, adorable, or a dimensional Neopia with a variant of Xandra, terrifying. Maybe one day someone will build a portal into one of these alternate universes. That would be fun." Thank you so much to Gutterfoot. I was absolutely ecstatic to get a response. I think the multiverse idea is really fun too, and the idea of a dimensional Xandra gave me a spark of inspiration for a picture that I will hopefully get around to drawing in the next 1,000,000 years or so. There is so much magic in Neopia and so much opportunity for unique stories. I'm still trying to come up with backstories and explanations for my dimensional Bunny and Plushy Kugra, because I love them, but there's an added layer of complexity in working out how they fit in with the rest of my pets and the world as a whole. The same goes for the toy and chocolate Uni, which I absolutely adore, and decided that because of the aforementioned reasons, I wouldn't actively seek one, but if I'm ever lucky enough to receive a Fountain Fairy quest, I would use it to get either one or the other. Speaking of Unis, that brings me to the next thing I wanted to talk about. While most of Neopia's residents are anthropomorphized, Unis remain quadrupedal and are most often portrayed as mounts for other pets, which is cool, but it does bring about a bit of the classic Goofy and Pluto type scenario. Personally, I imagine them being sort of like My Little Ponies, in that despite their anatomy, they're still able to wear clothes, pick up and manipulate items with their hooves, and generally interact with the world in the way a human would. I also apply that same logic to Piofins. That being said, while Nightsteed does get at least a couple of scenes of his own, Solarin is just sort of treated like a taxi throughout the events of the Darkest Fairy. Then again, I suppose that's perhaps his job, though if there is ever a remake of the game, I'd love for him to at least have some speaking lines. Also, please release it on PC. As for the issue of being ridden, I would interpret that as a personal choice. They're kind of in a cool and unique position. Personally, if I were a strong, magical horse creature, I would be more than happy to let my trusted partner ride on my back. I can just picture us galloping gracefully and majestically through the winding paths of an enchanted forest, the wind in our hair as my hooves pound rhythmically through the underbrush and splash through shallow streams. Then we'd break into a clearing and I'd launch myself into the air, catching the breeze under my wings and soaring off over the rainbow together. I don't picture Elia from Uni's Clothing, for example, to be the sort to volunteer to let others ride her, or to take on a job doing so. In the future, I'd love to see more Uni characters just coexisting with other pets and living their lives, but until then, the topic of Uni's Clothing brings about yet another question. This is a bit of a nitpick, a personal gripe, but I personally am not a fan of anthropomorphized characters being drawn with these hoof hands. The Fruit Machine Cow in particular absolutely squicks me the heck out if I look too closely at their hands. I don't know why, but seeing that just triggers a profound response of fear and disgust from deep within me. I much prefer hoofed species to be portrayed with normal hands, like Nabil and Hanso, perhaps including fingernails in the color of the hooves if it's important to the artist to incorporate that element. When I look at Tobias, the Ixie Altador Cup announcer, all I can think is, are his hands made of solid keratin? And how does he move his fingers? Can he even feel things with them? But again, I apologize for going off in a tangent, and I'm truly sorry if I disparaged anyone else's creative vision. I only meant to express my preference in how I like to view characters as having either one or the other, but everyone sees the world differently, and if the hoof hands are what resonate with you, I completely respect that. Neopets does have a lot of diverse and sometimes inconsistent art, and while it would be nice to have a solid canon point of reference for some things, I don't actually think it all that necessary. There is so much room for creativity and unique interpretation. Neopets aren't bound by our terrestrial laws. A lot of the time, I think the best answer is just whatever speaks to your imagination the most. There are also individuals like the Ghost Loop, who are clearly not anthropomorphized like the other characters, but I think we're all familiar with the concept of humanoid ghosts crawling around in the nude. Why should it be any different for Neopets? He's a mystical, spiritual apparition. I think he can take on whatever form he likes. I mean, we canonically have Ixies that look like this, and also like this. Not everything needs a perfect explanation or analysis. Sometimes things are simply wonderful the way they are. Speaking of clothing, I was recently rereading Curse of Morocco, and I noticed that this rookie had nary a stitch of clothing on. Is that allowed? Can he do that? And I do realize that there have been other nudists sprinkled throughout Neopian history. To be honest, I don't know why the rookie stood out to me so much. It's common, especially in older plots, for background characters to be far less anthropomorphized. I think I'd probably considered the Lost Desert plot, which came out right after Curse of Morocco, to be the beginning of the era where they more or less kind of began to solidify the character designs for the lore in the comics. I also don't count Wraith Resurgence because I feel they just used slightly edited standard Neopets as a tragic byproduct of Neopets management in its current state, not even being willing to bother coming up with unique characters because it's cheaper just to use existing assets than it is to pay artists. It's frankly careless and insulting, but that's enough about that for now. I suppose the Neopian clothing market requires clothing to be stocked in a variety of shapes as well as sizes to accommodate for some of the unique body types of some of its residents. I thought Werther was a really cool character in that we got to see a little bit more focus on a pet whose design didn't necessarily fit the standard. Even just the simple fact that I'm making this video speaks to the fact that no two people are going to experience Neopia in the exact same way. And I think that's beautiful. I've personally detached myself from the role of owner when it comes to my Neopets, because as I mentioned before, I like to imagine them as being their own characters who have their own stories that intertwine with the plots, characters, and legends of Neopia. But there was a time when I did imagine inserting myself as their owner or a mother figure. And if your unique vision of Neopia is to exist with a foot in both of those worlds, why not? A lot of my biggest inspiration as an artist and writer growing up came from users with ongoing comics and series in the Neopian times, a lot of whom did craft absolutely amazing stories, personalities, and relationships for their pets, and had themselves as an owner figure. One of my absolute favorite things to do was to look at people's pet pages to see more details and art of the characters and families I'd grown to love. When I was in grade 7, we had a school assignment to write a journal about our ultimate dreams and goals in life. And one of the things I wrote down was that I wanted to be published in the Neopian Times, something I've yet to achieve, but perhaps someday. Neopia is awash with magic, creativity, and endless possibilities. I believe its avenues for unique expression and immersive lore are what makes it so special and what keeps people coming back to it. I think what those trying to capitalize on the Neopets IP completely fail to understand is that the current user base, comprised in large part by adults, is not there because of nostalgia, but because they genuinely love Neopets and the Neopian experience. What we have is already unparalleled and irreplaceable. Yes, the newest Neopets meta roadmap did address some of the things I specifically brought up when I filled out their survey, which I do appreciate, but I still feel this project misses the mark entirely when it comes to the actual Neopets community. I read an article that likened it to throwing a party and snubbing all of your real, old, loyal friends in favor of inviting all the rich kids, i.e. the crypto bros, which I think is a fairly apt analogy. Based on the language they've used and the posts they've made, it's been pretty clear that this project is by and large not for the active Neopets fanbase, but for individuals in the crypto sphere with a vague sense of nostalgia for Neopets. We actually already had Neopets V2, thank you. He held a bunch of kids against their will in an elevator, tortured, and nearly suffocated them, yet somehow this project still feels far more insidious. The fact that NetDragon apparently had the resources to back a project of this scale while cutting staff, ignoring their loyal users, and leaving the real Neopets.com stagnant to hemorrhage features and events for years while raking in microtransactions makes me absolutely sick. It makes me livid. We haven't had a proper plot in years. Defenders of Neopia has been broken for about a decade. You can't even properly see the customizations many people did spend real money on because the website is in shambles after the death of Flash. But they do have the time and resources to constantly pump out NC Mall items. And it's sad, because I do want to financially support the site that I love, but I vote with my wallet, and I feel I can't in good conscience until a lot of these issues are addressed and resolved. Our cries have fallen on deaf ears for far, far too long, and this has just been the final slap in the face. With all that being said, I want to say unequivocally that my ire is directed specifically at upper management and the treatment of the Neopets IP as a whole. I completely disavow unprovoked harassment of people who've merely shown interest in the metaverse project on an individual level. I also feel bad for the Neopets team in terms of the hand they've been dealt. I'm sorry for going off about the NFT debacle. In light of these current events and the community outcry, I wanted this to be a positive video sharing something I love and to have a break from all the doom and gloom to focus instead on discussing the ways Neopia has touched and inspired us and what actually makes it so special. I felt, however, that I couldn't discuss my passion without mentioning this when it's been such a massive point of contention hanging over my head and stressing me out and upsetting me, as well as many others since its inception. There are other little things I ponder that I would have liked to talk about, but I felt they didn't exactly fit and/or I didn't have enough to say about them to warrant their own sections in the video. Like, what is the standard method for traveling to and from Dargan Citadel? If the Bringer of Night is considered a demigod, are there other Neopian gods, and what is their cultural significance? How did Werther get on Zoom? I thought that kind of technology was only available in Virtue Pets. At the end of the day, I don't think it really matters that not everything fits neatly together. Perfection in itself is boring, sterile, imperfect. Some of the most engaging and immersive pieces of media are flawed masterpieces, and Neopia is no exception. When I look at this culmination of passion, creativity, and vision, I see the still beating heart of Neopia that transcends any attempt to exploit, recreate, or replace it. This final part has gone on far longer than I'd expected, and I apologize for that, but I truly appreciate you sitting through this, and I would love to hear your own questions, headcanons, and just how Neopia speaks to you. If you're at all interested in getting into or back into Neopets, there's a nice thread on the Neopets Reddit with some helpful information. Thank you so very much for watching, and I wish you all a bright and beautiful new year in 2022.